The 28th of January 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The air was thick with steam and a biting, chemical smell that stung his nostrils, the delousing powder. Carl kept his eyes fixed on the gray, tiled floor, wet and shockingly cold beneath his bare feet. Beside him, a boy named Emil, maybe 16, was trembling so hard his teeth chattered a frantic rhythm against the hiss of the pipes. Carl placed a firm hand on the boy's thin shoulder, a useless gesture. What comfort could he offer? They were herded from the showers, the impossible, scalding heat still clinging to their raw skin. Propaganda had promised brutality, an animalistic enemy. Goebbels had screamed of vengeful cowboys. Instead, there was this sterile, disorienting efficiency. A painted sign on the wall read, "Shower, 5 minutes." A young American medic, a private first class, stood by a wooden table. He wasn't yelling. He looked bored, his eyes weary beneath the rim of his helmet. He was just doing a job. As each naked, shivering prisoner passed, the medic handed them a small bundle and the same small, metal object. When Carl reached him, the medic grunted, pushing a cool metal tube into his open palm. Carl flinched, expecting a blow. The medic just sighed. "It's okay. Clean. Sauber." Carl stared at the object. It was heavy for its size, embossed with blue letters he couldn't read. He turned it over. This was not the weapon of a savage. It was not the indifference of a barbarian. It was something else, something profoundly confusing. This was a different kind of war. If you want to see more moments that changed history, subscribe and let us know what country you're watching from. 4 weeks earlier, the Ardennes forest. The cold did not just surround them, it consumed them. It was an active, malevolent thing. A predator that had hunted Carl and his squad for weeks. Now, huddled in the frozen crater of an American artillery strike, Carl knew the hunt was over. 4 weeks earlier, the Ardennes forest. It was January 1945, and the Great Offensive had failed. The armored spearhead that was supposed to split the Allies and seize Antwerp had been shattered, its remnants scattered across this frozen, hostile forest. Carl, an Obergefreiter in name only, was now just a man trying not to die. Beside him, Hans, a 19-year-old from Dresden, coughed. It was a dry, racking sound that seemed to steal more heat from their shallow foxhole. "No movement," Carl whispered, his own voice a rasp. "They will roll past." Hans didn't answer. He just shivered, his eyes closed. "I cannot feel my feet, Carl. Not for hours." Carl understood. His own boots felt like blocks of ice, his toes a distant, aching memory. He pulled the thin wool blanket tighter around Hans's shoulders, a gesture of futility. The blanket was damp and stiff with frost. Above them, the skeletal arms of pine trees dripped snow, each small thud sounding like a rifle shot in the godless quiet. The quiet was the worst part. It meant the Americans were close. Carl tasted ash. He ran his tongue over his teeth, feeling the grit. Days ago, they had run out of salt. He had resorted to rubbing his teeth with clean ash from their meager fires, just to feel something other than the metallic tang of fear and starvation. It was a bitter substitute for civilization. It's mint? The words from the cold open are not here yet. This is the before state. A low, mechanical groan vibrated through the frozen earth. It was not thunder. It was not artillery. It was the sound that had haunted their dreams for a month. The growl of Sherman tanks. "They are coming," Hans whispered, his eyes wide with a dull terror. "Be still," Carl commanded, grabbing his Kar 98K. The rifle was useless. He had 3 bullets left. 3 bullets against the United States Army. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble in his chest, but it died in the cold. The grinding grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on snow. Voices, too. Not the sharp, guttural commands of German, but a lower, conversational tone. English. "If they find us, they will shoot us." Hans whimpered, reciting the propaganda they had been fed for months. The Americans take no prisoners. They are barbarians. They will shoot you on sight. Carl had believed it. It was easy to believe when the bombs were falling. But now, faced with the reality of this sound, he wasn't so sure. The propaganda spoke of savages, but these men sounded bored. They sounded cold. They sounded like him. The first tank lumbered into view through the shattered trees, a monstrous green shadow against the white. It stopped, its turret swiveling. Hans, look at me. Carl shook his friend. Hans's head lolled. A dark stain was spreading from beneath the blanket, where Carl now saw the torn, frozen mess of his friend's thigh, a shrapnel wound he had hidden. Hans was dying. Or perhaps, Carl thought, he was already the lucky one. The voices were closer. A beam of light cut through the pre-dawn gloom, dancing over the trees and landing squarely on their crater. Hände hoch, a voice called out, surprisingly clear. Then, in accented German, hands up. Schnell. Panic seized Carl. The propaganda images flashed in his mind. A ditch, a pistol, a final, brutal ending. He could fight. He had 3 bullets. One for the first American, one for the second. One for himself. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Hans, whose breathing was now a shallow rattle. He looked at his own hands, blue and shaking, caked in dirt and his friend's blood. This was not war. This was just dying in a frozen hole. The light blinded him. Last chance, comrade. Carl made his choice. He let the rifle fall from his numb fingers. It landed with a dull thud in the snow. He slowly, painfully, raised his hands. They felt impossibly heavy. Nicht schießen, he croaked. Don't shoot. Wounded. Verwundet. 2 figures in heavy winter coats and strange, bulky helmets slid down into the crater. They were huge, larger than any men Carl had ever seen. Or perhaps it was just their gear. One of them knelt by Hans, shining a flashlight on his leg. The soldier cursed softly. The other American, rifle leveled, stared at Carl. He was young, with frightened eyes. Carl just kept his hands raised, waiting for the shot. He had failed his country, his oath, his friend. He was a disgrace. But in that moment, as the icy wind cut through his uniform, he felt only one overwhelming thing. He did not want to die. The soldier with the rifle gestured with his chin. On your feet. Carl staggered up. His world reduced to this single, terrifying moment. The war, for him, was over. The train journey was a blur of steel walls and suffocating strangeness. For weeks, Carl had been a piece of cargo, moved from a ship's hold in New York to a series of crowded cattle cars, crossing a continent so vast it defied his imagination. He had seen more farmland in a single day than he had seen in his entire life in Germany. The sheer scale of America was its own form of psychological warfare. They arrived at night, marched from the train station under harsh floodlights that threw grotesque shadows. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The name meant nothing to him. Raus, raus. The shouts were in English now, but the tone was universal. Carl kept his head down, focusing on the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. He tried to project an image of stoic indifference, the ideal German soldier. Inside, his stomach was a cold knot of fear. This was it. This was where the propaganda would be made real. The stories Hans had whispered of vengeful guards and brutal labor echoed in his mind. They were herded into a long, brightly lit, wooden building that smelled overwhelmingly of unseasoned pine and a sharp, chemical odor he could not place. It was warm. The warmth itself felt like a trick, a softening up before the inevitable blow. All clothing off, alles aus. An American sergeant with a clipboard and a weary face shouted the orders. A German-speaking prisoner, clearly a trustee, translated with a dead voice. Everything, on the floor, now. This, Carl had expected. The ritual of humiliation. He stripped, his fingers fumbling with the buttons of his filthy field tunic. He avoided eye contact with the other men, all of them pale and thin, their ribs stark under the harsh electric lights. He felt not like a soldier, but like a piece of meat being prepared for a butcher's slab. He placed his boots neatly beside the pile of rags that had once been his uniform. They were pushed forward, naked, into the next room. A line of American soldiers, wearing masks over their faces and carrying metal canisters, stood waiting, arms up. Carl raised his arms. A nozzle was jammed into his armpit, and a cloud of white, stinging powder shot onto his skin. They puffed it into his hair, his groin, between his toes. He choked, the chemical smell DDT invading his lungs. It was an acrid, invasive scent, the smell of pest control. He was an insect. This was the dehumanization he had braced for. He felt a cold rage, but it was quickly extinguished by a deeper sense of powerlessness. After the dusting, they were shoved toward another door. Showers, 5 minutes. Carl flinched, expecting ice water. Instead, hot pressurized water hit his skin. He gasped, the shock of it almost painful. It was the first truly hot water he had felt in over a year. The steam filled the room, obscuring the faces of the men around him, and for a moment, the world dissolved. He scrubbed at his skin, trying to wash off the grime of the Ardennes, the filth of the transport, and the sting of the delousing powder. The hot water was a profound, confusing luxury. It felt like a violation of the rules, as if the Americans were breaking the code of war he had been taught. A whistle shrieked. The water cut off, instantly. The shock of the silence was as abrupt as the heat. Dripping, shivering, they were pushed into a final room. It was cold again, and the contrast made him tremble. Another set of tables. But these held stacks of new, dark blue clothing. A medic, a private first class with tired eyes, the same man from the cold open, stood at the head of the line. He looked no older than Carl. He was not sneering. He was not angry. He looked, Carl realized with a jolt, exhausted. The medic grabbed a bundle, trousers, a shirt, underwear, and thrust it at the prisoner in front of Carl. Then, he added a small, dark object to the pile. The prisoner took it and moved on. It was Carl's turn. He stepped up, water pooling at his feet on the wooden floor. He kept his eyes lowered, bracing for a blow, a shove, an insult. The medic sighed, shoving the clothes into Carl's arms. They were coarse, stiff, but clean. Then, the American tossed a small personal kit on top of the bundle. It was a razor, a bar of soap, and the small, metal tube. Carl's hands closed around the objects. They were solid, real. He didn't look at the medic. He just clutched the bundle to his bare chest and moved, following the line, toward the door that led out into the freezing Wisconsin night and the unknown life of a prisoner of war. The barracks was long, dark, and smelled of freshly cut pine and coal smoke. A single, pot-bellied stove in the center provided a circle of warmth that did not reach the corners. Rows of stacked wooden bunks lined the walls, creating corridors of shadow. Carl, clutching his bundle of clean clothes and his small kit, walked down the aisle. The new blue denim trousers and shirt felt abrasive against his clean, raw skin. He felt exposed, alien in this new uniform. He found an empty lower bunk near the far end, away from the door, and threw his blanket onto the thin mattress. He sat, the springs groaning in protest. For a long moment, he simply stared at the wooden slats of the bunk above him. He was clean. He was warm enough. He was alive. The propaganda had been wrong about immediate execution. But this, he reasoned, was just a different kind of trap, a way to make them soft before the real suffering began. He looked around. Other men were filtering in, finding their own spaces. They were quiet, spectral figures, all wearing the same anonymous blue, their faces scrubbed pale and blank with shock. Carl turned his attention to the kit in his lap. He laid the items out on the coarse wool blanket. There was a bar of soap, a harsh, yellowish block that smelled of lye. Useful, practical. There was a safety razor, its metal head gleaming dully. This, he found suspicious. Why arm a prisoner, even with something so small? He set it aside, wary, and then there was the tube. It was made of metal, perhaps tin, and felt cool and heavy in his palm. It was painted, with blue and red letters, He struggled to form into words. Colgate. The name meant nothing. Below it, ribbon dental cream. He understood dental. He knew the word Zahn. He held it, turning it over. In Germany, even before the front lines, such a thing was a luxury. For the past year, he, like all the other soldiers, had used salt when they could get it, or fine wood ash from a dead fire when they could not. The memory of the acrid, gritty taste filled his mouth. This tube was an absurdity. It was a decadent joke. He expected it to be a trick. Perhaps it was filled with something caustic, a subtle American torture. He looked at the small, fluted cap. Unscrewing it felt like a tiny, dangerous act of rebellion. He braced himself, half expecting a foul smell, a burning chemical. He twisted the cap. It came off easily. He brought the open nozzle to his nose and sniffed, cautiously. The scent was not foul. It was not chemical. It was sharp. It was clean, cool, and powerfully green. It was pfefferminz, mint. Carl froze. The smell rocketed through his memory, bypassing the war entirely. It was his mother's small herb garden in Stuttgart. It was the smell of Weihnachten candies, of peacetime, of a world that no longer existed. He had not smelled anything so deliberately clean, so unnecessary, in years. It made him want to weep. It was an olfactory shock, a sensory assault far more potent than the DDT. Why? Why would they give this to him? This was not for survival. This was not basic necessity. Salt was necessity. Ash was necessity. This mint. This was civilization. His suspicion warred with a desperate curiosity. His heart hammered. He looked around again. No one was watching. The other men were lost in their own misery. With a trembling finger, he squeezed the tube. A thick, perfectly white paste emerged. He touched a tiny amount, just a pinprick, to his fingertip. He looked at it. He put the finger in his mouth and tasted it. His entire nervous system recoiled. It was not bitter. It was not salty. It was sweet. An intense, almost painful sweetness, followed by the cooling explosion of the mint. It was shocking, sang-qui, and utterly overwhelming. It tasted of sugar and chemicals, and an impossible, casual wealth. He had tasted the enemy, and it was sweet. The door at the far end of the barracks creaked open, letting in a gust of frigid air. A tall, gaunt prisoner Carl hadn't seen before, with the hard eyes of a veteran from the Eastern Front, stalked in. He scanned the bunks, his gaze landing on Carl. Instinctively, Carl's hand closed. He crushed the tube in his fist, hiding it from view. The man, Manfred, grunted and took the bunk opposite Carl, throwing his own kit down with a clatter. Carl sat perfectly still, his pulse roaring. He was left with the tingling, electric taste of mint on his tongue and a profound, terrifying confusion that tasted nothing like home. The Appellhorn blared before dawn, a raw, ugly sound that ripped Carl from a shallow, restless sleep. He had dreamt of mint and ash, the two warring for control of his senses. In the dream, the mint had frozen his teeth, and the ash had tasted sweet. He sat up, his joints stiff. The barracks was a hive of quiet, miserable activity. Men dressed in the gray half-light, the air thick with the smell of stale bodies and the coal dust from the dying stove. Carl's hand instinctively went to his mattress, feeling for the small lump. The toothpaste tube was still there, tucked under the thin padding. He had slept with his hand on it, as if guarding a grenade or a relic. Manfred, the gaunt veteran from the Eastern Front, was already dressed, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He watched Carl, a flicker of contempt in his gaze. "Time to wash, Kameraden," Manfred announced to no one in particular, his voice loud in the quiet room. "Let us see what luxuries the Americans provide for us today. Perhaps coffee? Perhaps a warm bath?" His words were laced with a sarcasm so bitter it was almost a threat. Carl ignored him. He grabbed his small kit and a thin postage stamp-sized towel and joined the line of men shuffling out into the pre-dawn frigid air. The wash-house was a separate, unheated wooden structure. It was a long trough of galvanized metal, with a dozen faucets spitting out a single stream of painfully cold Wisconsin water. The air was thick with steam from the men's breath. Carl found a space at the end of the trough. He set his kit on the damp wooden shelf. The bar of lye soap was for his body, but the tube was for his mind. He was acutely aware of Manfred and two other men taking up a position just behind him, ostensibly waiting for a faucet. He could feel their eyes on his back. "Do not show weakness," his old training screamed. "Do not stand out. Blend in. Survive." But the memory of the taste from last night, that clean, sharp, sweet shock, was stronger. It was a rebellion against the filth, the ash, the degradation. His hands were shaking, as much from cold as from nerves. He unscrewed the cap. He squeezed a small, white ribbon onto his finger. He had no brush. He would use his finger. "Look at this." Manfred's voice was low, but it carried. "A connoisseur. He enjoys the finer things." Another man chuckled, a harsh, barking sound. "He has been here one day, and already he is one of them. He prefers their sweet poison." Carl's face burned. He kept his back to them. He put his finger in his mouth, rubbing the paste against his teeth. The mint exploded. It was even more intense than he remembered, a chemical cold that seemed to shock his brain into clarity. It was clean. God, it was clean. It cut through the morning fog of sleep, the stale air of the barracks, the smell of fear. He scooped water from the trough into his cupped hand and rinsed. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache. But the aftertaste was magnificent. It was the taste of order, of a world where things were not constantly rotting. He turned, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. Manfred was standing directly in his path, blocking him. Manfred was taller than Carl, all bone and contained fury. "That is American decadence," Manfred said, his voice quiet, deadly. "It is soap," Carl replied, his own voice sounding thin. He held up the tube. "It is a lie," Manfred hissed, jabbing a finger toward the tube. "They give you this sweetness, to make you forget you are a soldier, to make you weak. While they firebomb our families in Dresden, they give you candy for your mouth." Carl froze. He thought of his mother in Stuttgart. He had not considered this. The guilt was immediate and sharp. "I am not weak," Carl said, his throat tight. "Then you will throw it away," Manfred challenged. "You will use salt, like a German." Carl looked at the toothpaste tube in his hand. It was just a small, stupid thing, but it was his. It was the first thing in this new world that was his. He thought of the ash, the grit, the taste of defeat. "No," Carl said. He pushed past Manfred. It was not an aggressive move, but it was a final one. He did not look back as he walked out of the wash house, the cold air hitting his face, the taste of mint still burning on his tongue. He walked toward the mess hall, his heart pounding. He had drawn a line. As he reached the corner of the barracks, he saw one of the American guards, a young private, standing near the fence. The guard was yawning, clearly at the end of his shift. It looked like he should be in school. Private Miller. The name was on his helmet. As Carl watched, Miller pulled a small tube from his own pocket. It was identical to Carl's. The guard squeezed a bit onto his finger, rubbed it quickly over his teeth, and spit into the snow. Miller caught Carl's eye across the frozen compound. The guard didn't smile, nor did he look angry. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, a shared, human moment of morning ritual, before shouldering his rifle and walking away. Carl stood, rooted to the spot, the world tilting slightly beneath his feet. It wasn't decadence. It wasn't poison. It was just standard. 3 weeks passed. Carl settled into the strange, suspended rhythm of Camp McCoy. It was a life of profound boredom, punctuated by routine. The pre-dawn appel, the mediocre but plentiful food, the constant gnawing cold of the Wisconsin winter, and the endless, quiet observation. He had learned to navigate the internal politics of Barracks 12. He kept his head down. He avoided Manfred's zealous clique, who seemed to draw strength from their own denial, performing calisthenics in the snow and whispering of secret weapons. He also avoided the handful of men who were openly anti-Nazi, who were deemed traitors by the former. Carl existed in the silent, gray majority, the defeated. Every morning, he performed his ritual. In the freezing wash house, he would use a tiny, carefully measured amount of the toothpaste. The minty sting was a private reminder that the world was larger and more complex than Manfred's bitter ideology. It was his 5 seconds of clarity. Then, he was assigned to a new work detail. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, non-commissioned officers and enlisted men could be put to work in non-military roles. They were to be paid, and the officers at McCoy had dutifully set up a system of camp script coupons that could be used at the camp commissary. Carl was not sent to the fields. He was assigned to the main mess hall and commissary, a massive complex that fed thousands of men, both American and German, every day. His first assignment was on the loading dock, unloading a supply truck. He and 4 other prisoners were marched to the back of the commissary by a single, bored-looking guard who carried his rifle slung over his shoulder, muzzle down. The guard, a corporal, leaned against the brick wall, lit a cigarette, and motioned to the truck. "Get to it, Kameraden." Carl grabbed a wooden pallet. The truck was full, packed to the roof with brown cardboard boxes. He expected sacks of potatoes, crates of turnips, perhaps Spam, the standard, dull bulk of army sustenance. He was prepared for labor. He was not prepared for what he found. The first boxes were heavy. He grunted, sliding one off the truck bed. The side stenciling read, "Maxwell House Coffee." A small tear in the corner of the box released an impossible, intoxicating aroma. It was not the ersatz, substitute, drink of roasted barley and chicory that had been the only coffee in Germany for years. This was real. The smell of it alone felt like a memory of a lost world. He and his partner, a quiet Austrian named Dieter, stacked the heavy boxes. The air growing thick with the scent of roasted beans. An entire truckload, Carl thought. Just coffee. The next layer was lighter. Ivory soap. He handled the boxes, imagining what was inside. Not the harsh yellow lye block he was issued, but probably the white, fragrant soaps he saw advertised in the American magazines Life, the Saturday Evening Post, that were sometimes left in the camp library. He was moving in a state of muted shock. The sheer volume. This was not a country rationing its resources for a desperate, total war. This was a country casually consuming, its productive power a bottomless, churning ocean. Then, they reached the back of the truck. A single wooden crate, smaller than the others, had been damaged in transit. One of its slats was broken. "Careful with that one," the corporal called out, not looking up from his cigarette. Dieter grabbed one end, Carl the other. As they lifted, the broken slat gave way. The contents of the crate spilled onto the frozen dock with a series of dull thuds and clatters. Carl froze. It was not ammunition. It was not medical supplies. It was toothpaste. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of small metal tubes tumbled onto the concrete. They were identical to his. Colgate Ribbon Dental Cream. Blue and red letters on a white and tin background. He stared at the spill. The guard swore, annoyed, and came over to kick a few of the rolling tubes back toward the crate. "Well, pick 'em up. Salvage what you can." Carl knelt, his hands numb. He picked up one tube, then another. The same tube he had guarded like a relic. The same luxury that Manfred had called decadence. The same minty paste he had used sparingly, terrified of it running out. Here, they were spilled on a dirty loading dock like common gravel. In that instant, the war was truly over for Carl. Goebbels's speeches, the pictures of the Führer, the maps of the Eastern Front, it all dissolved into a pathetic, hollow lie. A country that could produce this much soap, this much coffee, and so much toothpaste that they could afford to spill it. A country that gave it to their prisoners as a standard issue item, was a country that could not be defeated. Germany had been trying to win a war with ersatz coffee and wood ash. America was fighting with a tidal wave of mint. He felt a cold, quiet anger rise in him, but it was not directed at the bored guard. It was for the men who had lied to him, who had fed his friends into this anaconda of industrial might. He looked down at the tube in his hand. Colgate. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the words on these boxes, in these magazines. He needed to understand the language of the people who had this much power. As he helped sweep the remaining tubes back into the broken crate, one small, undamaged tube of toothpaste remained near his boot. He glanced at the guard, who was already lighting another cigarette. Carl bent down, and the tube disappeared into the pocket of his blue denim trousers. The decision to learn English was one thing. The opportunity was another. It came not through official channels, but through whispers in the mess hall. A local pastor, Reverend Davies, had permission to enter the camp. He was ostensibly there for the souls of the Lutheran prisoners, but his true passion, it was rumored, was education. He ran a small, unofficial English class in a storage room behind the camp chapel, well away from the eyes of both the hardline German Lager Gestapo and the American camp command, who found the arrangement convenient to ignore. Carl found the class. He followed Dieter, the quiet Austrian from the loading dock, one rainy Tuesday evening. The storage room smelled of damp hymnals, old newsprint, and floor wax. 8 other prisoners were already there, sitting on overturned buckets and wooden crates. They were older men, mostly, or younger ones like Dieter who had the weary eyes of non-believers. Manfred's clique was conspicuously absent. Reverend Davies was a short, round man in a slightly rumpled black suit, his face kind but etched with exhaustion. He greeted Carl with a simple nod and handed him a small worn book. A first reader for new Americans. "Welcome, son," he said in clear, slow German. For 2 weeks, Carl's world expanded. He learned, "The cat sits on the mat." He learned, "I am cold," and "Please pass the bread." He learned the names for the items in his kit: soap, razor, and the word he had been waiting for: toothpaste. The sounds were awkward in his mouth, a different shape from German, but each new word felt like a small, stolen victory. The classroom became a sanctuary, a 60-minute truce from the war inside his head and the war inside the wire. On the 3rd week, the atmosphere was different. The rain had returned, drumming a loud funereal rhythm on the tin roof of the chapel. Reverend Davies was late, and when he arrived, he was not carrying his usual stack of readers. He was carrying a single, folded newspaper. His face was grave. He placed the newspaper, the Lacrosse Tribune, on the small table. "Good evening, men," he said, his German sounding heavier than usual. "Tonight, our lesson is difficult." He unfolded the paper. Carl, sitting in the front, could see the headline on the editorial page. Even with his limited English, the words were stark. "Cod dealing the enemy." The Reverend took a deep breath and began to translate. His voice was steady, but tinged with a deep, personal sadness. "While our boys," he read, "are bleeding and dying in the mud of Europe, we at home are treating Hitler's elite soldiers to a vacation in the Wisconsin countryside. We hear reports of prisoners dining on chicken, of being paid for their work, of receiving medical care and luxury items denied to our own citizens by the ration." A cold silence fell over the room, broken only by the drumming rain. Carl felt the blood drain from his face. Luxury items. He thought instantly of the toothpaste tube, hidden in his mattress. "This is a disgrace," the Reverend continued, his voice dropping. "A slap in the face to every American mother who has given a son to this war. These are not guests. They are the enemy. They deserve nothing but hard labor and basic bread. We call on the camp commandant to end this shameful coddling, immediately." He finished reading. He carefully folded the newspaper and placed it back on the table. Dieter spoke first, his voice thin. "They will stop you from coming, Herr Pastor? They will stop the classes." Another man muttered, his face dark. Reverend Davies looked at the small group, his gaze resting on each of them. "This," he said, tapping the newspaper, "is a part of America too. It is a free country. That means people are free to be angry. They are free to be wrong. He picked up the paper. They are not wrong to be angry. They have lost sons. Their fear is real. Their pain is real. But they are wrong about us, Carl said, the German words surprising him. It was the first time he had spoken in the class. The Reverend nodded slowly. They are wrong about humanity, Carl. This article says we should be like our enemies, hard, cruel, without mercy. It says that to win, we must become what we are fighting. And I do not believe that. He held up the editorial. This is not our lesson today. Our lesson is this. It is easy to be kind when everyone agrees with you. It is very, very difficult to be kind when your friends and neighbors call you a traitor for it. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. The commandant will be under great pressure. This class may be suspended. But I am here tonight, and I will be here next week, if they let me in the gate. Now, let us review our verbs. Carl sat, the words toothpaste and luxury and coddling rattling in his head. He had seen the American system as a simple, massive, wealthy machine. He had not realized it was at war with itself. He had not realized that the kindness he had received was not a policy, but a choice. A choice that some, like the Reverend, had to fight for. When the class was dismissed, Carl was the last to leave. He wanted to thank the pastor, but the man was already packing, his face drawn. Carl stepped out from the chapel's side door into the dark, rainy compound. He pulled his collar tight, his mind racing. He was 10 steps toward his barracks when a shadow detached itself from the wall. Then another. The little student. Manfred's voice sneered, cutting through the sound of the rain. Did the Americans teach you how to thank them? Did they teach you to say bit when they give you their sweet poison? Carl stopped. Manfred and 2 of his true believers were blocking his path back to the barracks. They were not armed, but they didn't need to be. The threat was absolute. It is just a language, Manfred, Carl said, trying to keep his voice steady. It is treason, Manfred hissed. And we know how to deal with traitors. The rain was cold, a steady, miserable drizzle that slicked the mud between the barracks. The yellow light from the chapel door barely cut through the gloom, trapping the 4 men in a small, tense circle of shadow. Carl stood, his worn first reader clutched in his hand. The book suddenly felt heavy, an indictment. Treason, Manfred repeated, stepping closer. The 2 men behind him fanned out slightly, cutting off any path of retreat. They were not soldiers anymore. They were a wolf pack. It is not treason to learn, Carl said. His voice was steadier than he felt. The fear was cold and metallic in his throat, but the pastor's words, "It is difficult to be kind," still echoed in his ears. You learn their words. You eat their food. You use their... Manfred spat the last word, his eyes glittering with a fanatic's rage. I have seen you, in the wash-house, every morning, like a little Fräulein. One of the other men, a Corporal Carl vaguely recognized from the artillery, laughed. He likes their poison. He likes the taste of it. While our brothers die, you learn to speak the language of the men who kill them, Manfred hissed, jabbing a finger into Carl's chest. The poke was hard, meant to intimidate. You have forgotten Dresden. You have forgotten Hans. Carl flinched. The mention of Hans, the boy who had died in the Ardennes, was a low, calculated blow. I have forgotten nothing, Carl said, his own anger now rising, cutting through the fear. Hans is dead. And you know why? Because he was starving and freezing, and all the propaganda in the world could not keep him warm. He died a hero, the corporal shouted. He died in a hole. Carl shouted back, his voice cracking. And they are not who we were told. They are weak, Manfred insisted. Decadent. Soft. This camp is a trick, camarade. A lie to make us soft, like you. Carl looked at the man before him, the gaunt face, the burning eyes, the absolute, unshakable certainty. Manfred was a true believer. He was the end result of Goebbels's machine. A man who would rather die, who would rather kill, then admit the world was not what he had been told. He was still fighting the war. Here, in the mud of Wisconsin. This was the Lager Gestapo, the secret, self-policing terror that ran through the camps. Carl had heard the rumors of men who were too friendly with the Americans being beaten in the night of summary trials held in the latrines. He was now on trial. He had to make a choice. He could apologize, throw the book in the mud, beg forgiveness. He could retreat into the gray, silent majority, or he could stand on the small, strange patch of ground he had claimed for himself, a patch of ground that smelled like mint. "You are wrong," Carl said, his voice dropping, but hard as the frozen earth beneath his boots. He held up the first reader. "I am learning their words to understand why we lost. We have not lost. Look." Carl swept his hand, not at the barracks, but at the dark, vast land beyond the wire. "Listen. We are here. They are there. They brought us across an entire ocean. They feed us. They give us. This." He reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the second, stolen tube of toothpaste. He pulled it out, holding it up in the dim light. "They give us this, not to buy us, not as a trick." He looked directly into Manfred's eyes. "They give it to us because they have it to give. They have so much of it. They spill it on loading docks. This is not a luxury to them. Manfred, it is nothing. This is their ash. This is their salt." The rain ran down his face, or perhaps it was sweat. "We were told we were the Herrenvolk, the master race, and we were reduced to cleaning our teeth with ash. That is the decadence, Manfred. That is the weakness. We lost because we forgot how to be human. And they build so many of Hello. They can afford to give it to their dogs. And to us." He had gone too far. He saw it in Manfred's eyes. The fanaticism cracked, and pure, unfiltered hatred poured through. "You are a pig," Manfred whispered. "A traitor. Eating from their trough." He didn't punch Carl. He didn't use a knife. He simply lunged, shoving Carl with all his weight. Carl, off balance and exhausted, slipped in the mud. He fell backward, his head cracking against the wooden steps of the chapel. The world exploded in white-hot pain. The first reader and the toothpaste tube flew from his hands, landing in a muddy puddle. He lay there, stunned, the rain falling on his face, the taste of mud and iron in his mouth. Manfred stood over him, breathing hard. "You are dead to us, Gefreiter." Manfred spat on the ground near Carl's head. "You are not German anymore. You are nothing." He turned and, with his two shadows, stalked off into the darkness, vanishing between the barracks. Carl lay alone in the rain for a full minute, the world spinning. His head throbbed. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his elbows. He saw the book first, its pages already dark and warped by the muddy water. He rescued it, tucking it inside his shirt. Then, he saw the tube. It was half buried in the grime. He picked it up, wiping the mud away on his trousers. It was dented, but intact. He got to his feet, swaying, and made his way back to Barracks 12, the victor in a war that no one else had seen. Spring arrived late in Wisconsin, but it came with a sudden, violent green. The snow melted, revealing a camp thick with mud, but also the first, hesitant shoots of grass. The air, for the first time in months, did not hurt to breathe. Carl's life had settled into a new, hard pattern after the confrontation with Manfred. He was an outcast. He ate alone. He worked in the commissary, stacking the endless, impossible wealth of America. And in the evenings, he sat on his bunk and read his muddy first reader by the dim light. His head had healed, leaving a small scar in his hairline, but the divide in Barracks 12 was now a permanent, unbridgeable chasm. Manfred and his followers had grown more fervent as the news from the front, gleaned from discarded American newspapers, grew worse. They spoke of the Alpenfestung, the Alpine fortress where the Führer would make his final, glorious stand. They clung to the lie, polishing it like a weapon. Carl, reading the English headlines, knew better. He knew Cologne was bombed. He knew Rhine was crossed. He knew the war was over. He was just waiting for everyone else to be told. The news came on a bright, cool afternoon on the 8th of May, 1945. Karl was outside, hauling sacks of flour. The work was hard, but he welcomed it. It kept his mind quiet. It started not as a sound, but as an absence. The camp was, for a moment, perfectly silent. The usual clang of machinery, the shouting of commands, all of it ceased. Then, a single whoop. It came from the American side of the compound, from the guard tower nearest the main gate. A solitary, joyous cry. It was followed a second later by another. Then, as if a dam had broken, a roar. Karl dropped the sack of flour, a white cloud exploding at his feet. He looked up. The guards in the towers were throwing their helmets in the air. Men were pouring out of the American barracks, embracing, shouting. A jeep, which was supposed to be observing the speed limit, tore down the camp's main road, its horn blaring a frantic, triumphant rhythm. Private Miller, the young guard Karl had seen in the washhouse, was hugging his sergeant, lifting the larger man clean off the ground. It was a celebration. It was chaotic, unrestrained, and loud. Karl looked around at his fellow Germans. They had all stopped working. They stood, frozen, in the bright sunlight, like statues in a forgotten park. This was it. Propaganda, a man beside him whispered, his voice trembling. It must be. Karl just watched. He felt no urge to celebrate. He felt no urge to cry. He felt, more than anything, a profound, hollow emptiness. It was the sound of a story ending. The story of his country. The story of his youth. He walked, numb, back toward his barracks. The Americans were too busy celebrating to stop him. He stepped inside Barracks 12. It was a tomb. Men were sitting on their bunks, staring at nothing. In the corner, an older Feldwebel, a man who had fought in the First World War, was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. In the center of the room, Manfred was on his feet, his face pale, his fists clenched. Lies, he shouted at the silent room. Jewish lies from the radio. The Führer would never surrender. This is a trick to break our spirit. No one answered him. No one even looked at him. His fanaticism, once a source of power, now seemed pathetic. The raving of a madman in an empty theater. Karl sat on his own bunk. He felt a strange, dual emotion. There was the deep, aching sorrow for his home. He saw Stuttgart in his mind's eye, not the city of flags and parades, but the city of his mother's herb garden, the bakery on the corner, the old church bell. He knew, instinctively, that it was all gone, turned to rubble. He was an orphan, not of a mother, but of a nation. But beneath the grief, there was something else. A small, guilty, but powerful feeling. Relief. It was over. The killing was over. The lies were over. The dying, in the mud, in the snow, for a monstrous, insane idea, was finally, blessedly, over. He was alive. He had survived. He did not have to clean his teeth with ash ever again. He looked up, drawn by the noise, toward the open barracks door. The celebration outside was still raging. Through the doorway, across the compound, he could see Private Miller. The young guard had seen Karl's barracks, had seen the silent, defeated men filtering back inside. Miller was standing apart from his cheering friends. He had retrieved his helmet. His face, moments ago ecstatic, was now subdued. Their eyes met across the wire. It was a distance of 50 meters, but it felt like 1,000 miles. The victor and the vanquished. Karl held his gaze. He offered no apology, no subservience. He was just a man, looking at another man. Miller's friends called his name, but he didn't turn. He looked at Karl, at the dark, silent barracks full of broken soldiers, and his celebration died. He did not smile. He did not sneer. He simply stood, a representative of the overwhelming, casual power that had won the world. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Private Miller raised his hand to his helmet and gave Carl a single, somber nod. It was not a salute. It was an acknowledgement. I see you. It is finished. Then he turned and walked away, rejoining his victorious world. Carl sat on his bunk, the roar of the celebration echoing from outside, the silence of the defeated howling within. The war was over. He was a prisoner of peace, and he had no idea what happened next. The war did not end for the prisoners on VE Day. It was simply replaced by a new, more profound state of limbo. 1,945 bled into 1,946. The world was reorganizing itself, drawing new lines on maps, and the men of Camp McCoy were, as ever, cargo. They were waiting to be shipped. Carl had watched as the camp slowly emptied. The true believers, like Manfred, had been segregated and were the last to be considered for repatriation. They were still unreconstructed, as the new camp terminology, filtered through the re-education program, described them. Carl, with his proficient English and his quiet, cooperative demeanor in the commissary, had been reconstructed. He was simply waiting for his name to appear on a list. He had spent the year working, reading, and thinking. The news from home, arriving in censored, 6-month-old letters, was not of a homeland, but of a ruin. Stuttgart was a field of rubble, his mother a refugee somewhere in the French zone. He was not returning home. He was being sent to an archaeological dig, a place of ghosts. The fear of returning was, he was ashamed to admit, greater than the fear he had felt in the Ardennes. Then, in the spring of 1946, his name was called. The processing out was the mirror image of his arrival. It was the same sterile, disorienting efficiency, but in reverse. He and 100 other men stood in line in the same processing building where they had been deloused. This time, they were handing things back. He placed his coarse blue denim shirt and trousers, washed and folded, on the counter. He handed back the thin blanket, the worn-out boots. He was stripped, for a moment, back to his basic issue underwear, standing on the cold concrete. He was no longer a Wehrmacht soldier. He was no longer a POW. He was, for a terrifying second, nothing. They were given traveling suits. They were cheap. Civilian suits. Made of a thin gray material, donated by charities. They fit poorly and smelled of mothballs. At the end of the line, a clerk checked his name off a list and handed him his repatriation papers. He was now Carl Schmidt, civilian. He was walking toward the door that led to the trucks that would take him to the train that would take him to the ship, when a voice called his name. Schmidt. Carl turned. It was Miller. He wasn't Private Miller anymore. He wore the chevrons of a corporal, and his face was no longer the frightened, bored mask of a combat soldier. It was the face of a young man who was also tired of war and ready to go home. He was on duty, overseeing the final processing. Miller, Carl replied. He was surprised he remembered the name on the helmet. Miller came over, walking with the casual, confident gait of the victor. He stopped a few feet from Carl. It was the first time they had ever been this close, without a fence, or a power dynamic, or a rifle between them. "So, you're heading out," Miller said in English. "Yes, it is time," Carl replied, his own English careful and accented, but clear. They stood in an awkward silence. What was there to say? Thank you for the good food? Sorry about the war? Miller looked around, at the clerk, at the other processing soldiers. He seemed to make a decision. I read your file," Miller said, lowering his voice. "The stuff with the pastor. And that bastard Manfred. You had a rougher time in here than some." Carl just nodded, unsure what to say. "Anyway," Miller said, looking embarrassed. He fumbled in the large pocket of his trousers. It's not much. But where you're going, I hear things are tough." He pushed his hand toward Carl, a quick, almost furtive movement, like a schoolboy passing a note. "Good luck, Carl." Carl's hand closed around the object Miller had pressed into it. He knew what it was before he even looked. He knew its shape, its weight, its cool, metallic feel. He opened his hand. It was a new, full tube of Colgate toothpaste. The red and blue letters were bright, the metal uncrimped, the small cap screwed on tight. Carl looked at the tube, then up at Miller. In that moment, Carl finally understood. This was the weapon that had truly defeated him. Not the tanks, not the bombers, not the endless stream of supplies. It was this 5-cent article of casual, thoughtless, mint-flavored kindness. It was a standard that had been weaponized, not through malice, but through its simple existence. It was the symbol of a nation so rich, so confident, it could afford to be humane, even to its enemies. Even when its own citizens wrote angry letters to the editor, this toothpaste was the anchor object, not just of his time in the camp, but of his transformation. He had entered the war a soldier. He was leaving it a man, defined not by an ideology of blood and ash, but by the simple, complex power of mint. "Thank you," Carl whispered. It was the most honest thank you he had ever given. Miller just nodded, his face serious. "Go on. Get out of here. Go home." Carl clutched the small tube, the metal biting into his palm. It was the only thing he truly owned. It was his passport from the old world to the new. He turned and walked out of the processing center, into the bright, uncertain Wisconsin sunlight, and toward the train. Stuttgart, 1955. The city was a patchwork of scars and miracles. Cranes pierced the skyline, replacing the skeletal ruins with structures of concrete and glass. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was in full, noisy bloom, fueled by Marshall Plan dollars and a collective, desperate desire to forget. Carl stood in his bathroom. The room itself was a miracle. It was small, but the tiles were a clean, bright white. A porcelain sink held a bar of soap that smelled faintly of roses. A single, confident twist of the chrome faucet produced a stream of reliably hot water. He still, even after all these years, found a quiet wonder in that. He was a teacher now. He taught English at the local gymnasium to boys who were born during the war's final, desperate days. He taught them the grammar of his former captors, the language he had first learned from a muddy first reader in a storage room that smelled of damp hymnals. "Papa, it won't. It's stuck." His son, Paul, 5 years old, was standing on a wooden stool, his small face screwed up in concentration. He was wrestling with a tube of toothpaste. Carl smiled. He dried his hands on a clean, soft towel. "Here, let me see," Carl said, his German soft. He took the tube from his son. It was bright red and white now. The design changed, but the word was the same. Colgate. The tubes were everywhere, in every apotheke, in every shop. They were as German now as bratwurst or beer. Paul had mangled the cap, twisting it on sideways. "You are using too much force, Kleiner man," Carl said gently, his strong fingers easily correcting the thread. "You must be gentle with it." He took Paul's small, blue toothbrush and squeezed. A perfect, small ribbon of white paste appeared. "Not too much," he instructed. "Just this." Paul began brushing, his movements sloppy and enthusiastic, filling the small, warm bathroom with the powerful, clean scent of mint. The smell, as it always did, took Carl back. It was his anchor, his time machine. With one breath, he was no longer a 40-year-old teacher in a new apartment. He was 20, shivering in the freezing dark of the McCoy wash house, the water numbing his fingers, the taste of mint, a shocking, sweet explosion in his mouth. He could see Manfred's face, twisted with contempt. American decadence. He looked at the tube in his hand. Manfred, he thought, had been so wrong. He had died in 1950, Carl had heard, still a true believer, working in a salt mine in the East. He had died still believing in the lie, still tasting only ash. It was not decadence. It was a standard. That was the lesson he had learned. The lesson he now tried to teach his students, in ways the curriculum never intended. He taught them that power was not just tanks and planes. It was not just the roar of a V-2 rocket or the ideological purity of a Hitler-Jugend knife. Real power, the power that had won the war, and, more importantly, won the peace, was the power of a standard. It was the power of a nation that produced so much soap, so much coffee, so much toothpaste, that it could afford to give it away to its enemies. It was the soft, undeniable power of a culture that, despite its own deep flaws, its own angry editorials, had chosen, in the end, to anchor itself in a baseline of human dignity. The Marshall Plan had not rebuilt Germany with steel and concrete alone. It had rebuilt it with gestures like this, with the promise that everyone, even a defeated enemy, deserved a certain level of basic, civilized comfort. "Papa, you're dreaming." Paul was looking up at him, his mouth ringed in white foam. Carl blinked, the washhouse fading, the bright white tiles of his bathroom snapping back into focus. He smiled, grabbed a washcloth, and dampened it with warm water. "So I was," he said. "Rinse." Paul rinsed and spit, a mess of minty foam in the clean porcelain sink. Carl wiped his son's face. "All clean," Carl said, lifting the boy off the stool. "Good night, Papa." Paul ran out, his bare feet pattering down the hall toward his bedroom. Carl was left alone. He rinsed the sink, the scent of mint rising with the steam. He put the cap back on the toothpaste tube, his movements precise, practiced. He thought of the dented, muddy tube Miller had given him. He had carried it all the way home, a relic of his rebirth. He looked at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. The face that looked back was older. The scar on his hairline, where his head had hit the chapel steps, was invisible now. There were lines around his eyes, lines of a man who had seen too much and now found peace in the very small. He was not the Obergefreiter in the frozen forest. He was not the numbered, dehumanized prisoner in the delousing powder. He was Carl Schmidt, a father, a teacher, a free man. He took a deep breath, the air clean, and tasted only mint.